The film theory video titled Why PewDiePie's Fiverr Joke Backfired does present a strong argument towards what is a good joke and how to make a good joke, but this doesn't mean that it hasn't made a few leaps in logic and committed a few fallacies. I intend to analyze this film theory video from a purely logical perspective. I make this video not to call out film theory, but to show the logical mistakes that were made, so the film theorists and others may create logically stronger and more developed arguments in the future. I intend to follow the principle of charity during my analysis, to show the arguments presented in their best light in order to maximize their logical strength. However, I am not perfect and I do make mistakes. I am more than willing to accept correction if necessary. So let's start off with a basic summary of what we have to work with. MatPat organized his points in the pattern of a V argument. A V argument is one where the premises don't support other premises, but rather support the conclusion indirectly from each other. The conclusion of the argument in this video is to show what differentiates a good joke from a bad one, and how to deliver a joke that could be seen as offensive.
Today, I aim to answer what differentiates a good joke
what's his name?
His name is David.
From a bad one. And how to successfully deliver a joke that you expect to be offensive.
The 5 points that he uses to support his conclusion are: 1. Not setting up a joke correctly. 2. If the joke's source isn't seen as a comedian. 3. If the joke targets the wrong people. 4. If the joke is contradictory. Or 5. The joke stops being a joke when it has consequences outside of itself. The advantage of a V argument is that when one of the premises are false, it doesn't affect the strength of the other premises, because they are not connected. However, if one of the premises in a V argument is proven to be wrong, it does affect the overall support for the conclusion. So, now that we understand the way in which we have presented the argument, let's analyze the premises and determine whether they hold up to the test of logic. Number 1. Not setting up a joke correctly will lead to an offended audience.
Including leaving it just as subscribed to Keemstar, a frequent target on the channel and a joke that everyone would have gotten because, I mean, come on, it's Keemstar.
Not to nitpick, but it is not logical to assume that everybody would have gotten the Keemstar joke. When MatPat says this, he does mean it as a joke, but relying on a joke to support a claim is an appeal to ridicule. Ab absurdo, and is a logical fallacy. MatPat did state earlier in this video that he
just want a logical discussion here.
The final point to MatPat's premise is missing a part. He says if your source isn't crystal clear, you're going to have an offended audience.
A risky joke like that requires that all of those dots be connected, and if they are not crystal clear, then you're going to have yourself an offended audience.
What's missing is, because people might not recognize it as a joke and may see the joke as an attack on a minority group. While MatPat's argument was missing this point, he did provide evidence to support it earlier, and I have no real reason to doubt what he's saying.
Instead, it ends up belittling a group of victims of one of the worst crimes imaginable.
Point number 2. Source isn't a comic. In this premise, MatPat states that it's hard to see the difference between PewDiePie and Felix. To support this claim, he says it's YouTube and PewDiePie is on a face cam in a small room.
Because it's YouTube and he's doing it on a face cam in a small intimate room talking directly to us, it's often hard to see where PewDiePie ends and Felix begins.
Even if this is meant to contrast the setting the stage example that he gives a little later in this premise, this evidence does not follow the point being made and is a non sequitur, which is a fallacy. The presentation through and of YouTube, a webcam, and a small room does not give me a good reason to believe that there is a difference between PewDiePie and Felix. Maybe this evidence could support why it's hard to see PewDiePie isn't seen as a comic, but this is not the point that MatPat is making. The points that followed, talking about PewDiePie flipping in and out of character and directly talking to the camera, could be used towards how he isn't seen as a comic.
This is especially complicated when lots of his videos feature him talking openly to the camera, or others feature him flipping in and out of character.
But they lack evidence. MatPat assumes the truth of the thing he seeks to prove. He assumes that PewDiePie flips in and out of character, but he hasn't given any straightforward examples of him doing such, which ends up being a logical fallacy called petitio principii. To make these arguments more logical, MatPat needs to provide concrete evidence of PewDiePie and Felix swapping back and forth in and out of character. Otherwise, it is hard to see the logic behind this point.
I'm watching a show where this guy is trying to entertain me. Everything he says for the next 90 minutes are all part of his act. And that distinction between performer and person is very important when you're trying to make jokes that push the envelope.
The performer versus person statement MatPat makes is not a good point towards why a comedian isn't seen as a comic. But not necessarily because what he is saying is wrong. It's because he hasn't proven using PewDiePie that the setting of a comedic act is important. His first point about PewDiePie's comedic mode of presentation doesn't give good reason to believe the difficulty in the distinction between PewDiePie and Felix. The second point made by MatPat directly talking about PewDiePie flipping in and out of character has potential, but he doesn't provide direct evidence to support this, and thus it is fallacious.
Very subtle line that all YouTubers draw.
Also, the repeated use of all when talking about YouTubers is very risky. It's not safe to say that all YouTubers put on an act. There is certainly a possibility that some don't.
Sacco ultimately made the point that, quote, "Unfortunately, I'm not a character on South Park or a comedian, so I had no business commenting on the epidemic in such a politically incorrect manner on a public platform."
So while the Justine Sacco example is a good example doesn't always necessarily correlate to good evidence. I believe when MatPat gives the Justine Sacco example, he is appealing to anecdotal evidence. In other words, a general conclusion like the one he is making here, that the source isn't seen as a comic, is hard to justify from a single example that is taken in the form of anecdotal evidence. Without more concrete evidence, I believe that it's not strong enough to support the conclusion. Number 3, targeted the wrong people. During his third premise, MatPat states that some edgy jokes can be punching down.
The comedic term for when someone with greater power or privilege makes fun of a more marginalized person or group.
And during his premise, MatPat provides some very solid points towards PewDiePie exploiting people with his joke, essentially punching down on them. His evidence is PewDiePie indirectly or directly caused the Fiverr guys and HGJesus accounts to be shut down. The knowledge of the funny guys' English is incomplete, as well as their knowledge of what Judaism is, as well as what a Jew is. And that 267 million people living in India live on $1.25 a day.
Critics of PewDiePie's antics in the 2 Fiverr videos can make the same argument, that the video was exploitative to the funny guys, the young Indian men who wrote down and held up Pewd's message in the video. After the backlash to PewDiePie, all of these Fiverr accounts were suspended. In the video, we find out that their knowledge of English isn't that complete and that they didn't actually know what the term Jews meant. Guys really need the money from that Fiverr account. They live in a rural part of India, a country that the World Bank estimated in 2011 had about 276 million people living on $1.25 or less per day.
While this statistic doesn't mean that the funny guys are necessarily living on this wage, it is possible that they were living on this wage.
The same thing happened with HGJesus.
When MatPat says the same thing happened to HGJesus, this is not necessarily true. While HGJesus could be living through a tough financial situation, it can't be assumed that he also has no knowledge of English or of the Jews, and he probably doesn't live in India. He could, but he probably doesn't, and thus his situation is likely different than the funny guys. Point number 4, the joke is contradictory. MatPat hits the nail on the head when making this point. An especially strong reason is when MatPat argues about PewDiePie paying for people to make a video or a message, and then claiming directly after that he can't be held responsible. And when MatPat criticizes about how PewDiePie is responsible because he paid people to do that, he makes a really good contradiction.
You paid people across the world to do something that you considered shocking, and they did it. So, of course you're responsible. Own up to the joke.
However, the point that MatPat makes to go on after this is not so. When MatPat argues that PewDiePie's previous videos contradict what he is saying, unfortunately this is not the case.
With the Fiverr situation, PewDiePie was basically just saying the same thing. It's just a joke, that's what makes it okay. The situation is parallel, right down to the line in the song, "I got you fired, just a prank bro," as that's exactly what happened to the Fiverr account.
This fallacy is a little difficult to understand, so I'll try to do my best to explain it. In this situation, MatPat is committing a fallacy called tu quo que, or an appeal to hypocrisy. For example, a father who smokes tells his children not to smoke. While it is hypocritical of the smoker in this case to tell his children not to smoke, this information has nothing to do with whether the statement "do not smoke" is actually right or wrong. It does not affect the truth value. So, in the example of PewDiePie, just because he has satirized pranks and bad jokes in the past and is contradictory because he's made bad jokes today, doesn't mean that his arguments defending himself are any weaker. Is PewDiePie's joke contradictory? Yes. Does it contradict his older jokes? Yes. But does this discredit what PewDiePie is saying to defend himself? No. So, using this line of reasoning, MatPat can criticize PewDiePie's video hypocrisy, but to use this statement as evidence against what PewDiePie is saying to defend himself, which it is being used for, is a fallacy. Number 5. It stops being a joke once it has consequences outside of itself. The studies and examples MatPat provides when talking about PewDiePie normalizing hate could be considered an appeal to authority, but it's not, because the authorities he has listed are reasonably credible and the studies themselves are relevant.
There. In 2001, the study Low Involvement Learning, Repetition in Coherence and Familiarity and Belief, super exciting title I know, found that repeated exposure to phrases gets people more likely to believe them. In 2009, Sparks, Pelleccia, and Irvine published a study that showed how news outlets covered a story on UFOs greatly impacted whether viewers believed in the existence of UFOs. Another 2009 study found similar results for science TV news and how it affected people's scientific beliefs. And countless studies including perceived source variability versus familiarity, testing competing explanations for the truth effect, try saying that one 10 times fast, have shown that repeated phrases are believed more. Words matter, Felix, especially when you're influencing an audience of 50 million.
So, PewDiePie appeals to an audience of 50 million. When saying this, it is an exaggeration, considering a more probable and accurate representation of PewDiePie's views could be determined from his legitimate video views, which average about 2 to 3 million. Conclusion. During this conclusion, many statements MatPat makes have little logical backing. For example,
science has shown that humor is the most effective means of reaching those whose beliefs differ from our own.
While this would be a great point, it has no real backing, and it's an actual appeal to authority. MatPat has not provided studies to support this claim, nor any of the numerous claims he makes on the same topic.
If we're able to laugh, then we're willing to listen. In response, people from the target group will start doing stand-up comedy themselves. When the audience sees one of these new comedians on stage talking about themselves with a sense of humor, they begin to recognize how dimensional the stereotyped group is. Taboo or risque topics, because humor is a force for good. The voice of generations. Laughing is a force for positive change.
The final conclusion statement to this entire video is a non sequitur. It doesn't line up with the initial conclusion.
What truly matters here is that risky humor needs to be humor done right. It needs to have a clear and thoughtful purpose, because that's when it's at its most powerful.
The initial conclusion was interested in differentiating a bad joke from a good one, and how to deliver a joke that has the potential to be offensive.
Today, I aim to answer what differentiates a good joke
what's his name?
His name is David.
From a bad one. And how to successfully deliver a joke that you expect to be offensive.
The initial conclusion has nothing to do with power or how powerful a joke is. How powerful a joke is has no logical backing from MatPat's video. His 5 premises were designed for the first conclusion. To create a more logical and satisfying conclusion, MatPat should have summarized his 5 premises and linked them to his initial conclusion. MatPat presented a logical argument here. However, he did commit fallacies while accruing reasons for his premises, which caused many of his points to lose some of their support. one point entirely. Some of the statements MatPat makes are a little exaggerated, such as the "everybody will get the Keemstar joke" point. And his final conclusion was off, not really connecting with the 5 major points he spent developing, but rather connecting to the evidence lacking. Jokes are a force for good points. That's all I have to say on this topic right now. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, let me know so I can do more in the future.